This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Are you interested in growing plants on moss poles, but you just don't know which plants to choose in the first place? Well, in today's video, I'm showing you 10 of my current favorite plants that are growing on moss poles. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's not a secret that I'm a big fan of moss poles. They enable me to grow small plants into large statement pieces like the ones you see behind me over here. I started my moss pole journey just 3.5 to 4 years ago, so I have a lot of plants that had a lot of time growing up these moss poles, and I just want to show you what these plants look like so you can get some inspiration for my plants and maybe get some of these plants yourself. These plants are in no particular order. We're just going to talk about them as I come across them. So let's start off right over here. Alrighty, this is the first plant, and I might have to go back a little bit to fit it all in frame. Here, can you see this? Hang on, I need to go way further back. Hang on, I'll make you go further back. That's slightly better. Sorry, some of these plants are too big. It's going to be hard to get them in frame. Anyway, this is Philodendron Milano Chrysum, and it's been one of my very first plants, and I've only really had success with this plant over the last half a year or so. I've had the hardest time getting this to size up, so I'm really excited about these beautiful leaves it has given me recently. There's 2 shoots on this pole. The second shoot has its newest leaf over here. Also super nice and elongated, and that's really the main feature of Milano Chrysum. It has these really dark, long velvet leaves, which makes it a great plant to do hybrids with as well. So this is used in Philodendron glorious, the big one behind me over here. That's a hybrid of Milano Chrysum and gloriosum, and it's also used in splendid, which we're going to look at in a sec, where Milano Chrysum is hybridized with variegated to create a beautiful hybrid. Now, ultimately, I can't tell you exactly what I've done to make this plant happy, and I think it's a little more complicated than that. I actually had a conversation with Eric, United by Nature, who's a very experienced grower, and he said that it's not necessarily just one thing. It's not just more light, better temperatures. Sometimes these plants also need some variance in conditions to actually trigger maturity. So unfortunately, I don't have a major lesson for you that helps you mature your Milano quickly, apart from just staying patient. It will happen eventually, like it did for me. After 3 years, it finally is giving me nice large leaves. Now, there's also a new leaf coming up here. Hope the camera will focus on this, so I cannot wait for this to grow. Very beautiful plant. Very excited. All right, let's move on. Maybe let's focus on one that's quite similar. 1 second. Over here, I've got my Philodendron gigas. Philodendron gigas, very similar to the Milano. When they mature, when the leaves get older, they have these really large, dark leaves, but they're more teardrop shaped and not quite as elongated. Now with this plant, the new growth comes out with this really beautiful red. I think this light isn't amazing. Let me put some B-roll on there, what it looks like in sun or in light. They can get really nice and red, and the sheen on these is honestly unmatched. I probably prefer the sheen of these over the sheen of the Milano. Now what I've done over here, you might be able to see, I've got 2 poles potted up next to each other in the pot. So these poles used to live on top of each other, right? So I always have 90 centimeter poles, one here, one at the top. I chopped them, and I took these poles and I potted them next to each other. Both then reshoot, and now I have 2 shoots on this extension. So there's shoot number 1 coming from the first moss pole, and shoot number 2 coming from the second moss pole. So that way, without really having to propagate the plant outside of the chop and extend, I can double the impact. So very happy with this plant. This one is a little bit younger. I think I got it maybe 1.5 years after I got the Milano, so it's not quite as mature yet, but it's sizing up nicely. So I reckon by the time it reaches the top of the moss pile, I'm going to be rewarded with quite large leaves. Now this plant is called Philodendron gigas for a reason. It can get massive. So let's see what I can make out of this plant. All right, next one, let's have a look. Alrighty, hope this is all in frame. I think it is. This is Philodendron soliroy. It's my only non-velvet over here, and this has been in my care for maybe 2.5 years as well, 2 years maybe. Now, what is different about this plant than to the others that I've shown you so far is that it is a climber, but it's climbing really slowly. Let me show you from the side. So over the 2.5 years, this plant has never had a chop and extend. It was never cut. And it's only up to here on its moss pile at the moment. So it hasn't climbed very far, but it has matured quite nicely and it's given me a lot of leaves. So that just means that the internodal spacing, so the space between each node, is quite small. So if you're looking for a plant that is fairly low maintenance, meaning you don't have to chop and extend it or repot it frequently, then this is probably a great plant for you because it's going to take a long time until it outgrows its moss pile. This plant also has super beautiful backsides, and I'm going to put some B-roll on there for you as well so you can see it close up. And this is one of the only plants that I actually would use like a leaf shine on, or like I would actually wipe these leaves. They're in need for it. They're a little bit dull at the moment. I should really go ahead and shine these leaves a little bit. But I think that's part of my spring prep that's coming up really soon. Now this plant also has crazy petioles. Let me turn it around. So these petioles really go in all directions. So you can see I use some twine just to manage the petioles together and make a nice lush display out of these plants instead. All right, let me put that back. Oh, it's also growing its first flower, its first little inflow. Let me put a little video up on screen for you. So that's interesting, that's very exciting. I usually don't do anything with my philodendron flowers. I've heard that philodendron pollination is very tricky, so I'm kind of just ignoring that topic for now. Let's have a look at the last one in this room. And I might have to stay here because it's so large. Hang on, let me come a bit closer. Sorry, I honestly cannot go far back enough. Can you see this? This is the newest leaf, got a bit damaged rubbing against the wall. These leaves over here, can we see that? Yes. I think let's keep it here. Sorry for the framing, it's honestly super hard to get these really tall vertical plants into a landscape format. So this is Philodendron Splendid, and as I mentioned before, this is a hybrid of Philodendron Milano Chrysum, the one we saw first, and Philodendron Chrysum. Now it comes after both parents. It has these like large elongated dark leaves like a Milano, but it also has these red backs and textured petioles like a Chrysum. Now let's talk about hybrids for a second. Actually, let me put this back because it's kind of hard to maneuver, and then we talk about hybrids. But before we keep going with the video, let's hear about today's sponsor, Squarespace. I've used Squarespace to build my own website, and it's been such an easy and fast process. I started off with using one of Squarespace's professional website templates and then went and customized them. Using technology called Fluid Engine, I was able to add any elements that I want, remove any elements that I don't like, and just drag and drop and switch them around as I please. Furthermore, you can set up an online store and sell products. Whether you sell a physical, a digital, or a service product, Squarespace has the tools you need to start selling online. And lastly, you can also use Squarespace to set up appointments such as online or in-person private sessions, workshops, and group classes. Squarespace helps you manage your schedule, accept scheduled payments, sends automated reminders, and so much more. So, whatever business you have, Squarespace has the tools to help you succeed. You can head to squarespace.com/SydneyPlantGuy and save 10% of your first purchase of a website or domain using discount code SydneyPlantGuy. Again, thank you so much Squarespace for sponsoring this video, but let's get back into it. Alrighty, and we're back. With hybrids, they're usually, or in my opinion, or in my experience, I'm having a much easier time growing hybrids than growing the actual species. So if you are new to growing plants on moss poles and you want to try velvet philodendrons, I would highly recommend starting off with some of the hybrids rather than going straight for the species, because they just seem to have a much easier time. Alrighty, I think that's a little bit better. I changed the camera angle a little bit. So let's talk about these conditions of all of these plants. So they all live on the wall, and a question I get asked a lot is like, why aren't you growing plants on all sides of the moss pole? Why aren't you growing them 360? Sometimes I do, and we're going to see some examples in a second, but all of these plants live against a wall. I don't want any petioles to go towards the wall. I want to have a really nice display site at the front. Now that's kind of happening automatically, purely based on where the light is coming from. Plants want to find the light, so the leaves will face towards the light. Now I have a south-facing window here, a small west-facing window here, and then I have two mother grow lights mounted on top of each other to supplement the light over here. I have the mother grow lights in the description linked in case you want to learn more. The theme in this room is definitely kind of large velvet philodendron, but let's move on and let's have a look at some other plants. So we're kind of moving through my apartment chronologically. In this corner, we've got my variegated monstera deliciosa, and it is fueled by this nice Soltec light over here. You guessed it, they're also linked in the description if you want to learn more. Now, when it comes to monstera deliciosa, if you have a green form, you can totally put this on a moss pole, but I don't necessarily think a green monstera deliciosa would need a moss pole. Depends on your conditions though. Over here in Sydney, green monsteras grow everywhere. They grow up walls outside, they grow up lamp posts and so on. They are really not fussy. And if you think about the thick roots that they have as well, those roots are perfectly fine attaching to anything. They're not super flimsy, skinny roots that could dry out any time. They're very thick, succulent roots. So they don't necessarily need to be provided with constant moisture, which is what the moss pole would have to offer. Whereas if you compare that to my velvet philodendrons we just spoke about, they have much finer roots and they don't like drying out. So moss poles are perfect for those sort of plants. But when it comes to the variegated version is obviously already a bit stunted based on having variegation, and the variegation can't contribute to photosynthesis. So it's almost like holding the plant back. So in those instances, I want to make sure it has the perfect conditions and the best possible care to compensate for that shortfall, if that makes sense. So I have decided to give my variegated monstera a moss pole. The other benefit of moss poles, and if you want to learn more about my moss poles, I have a full tutorial, I have a full playlist on all things moss poles, how to make them, how to water them, how to extend them, how to chop and extend them, and so on. I'm not necessarily going to repeat all of these concepts in today's video. But if you are familiar with my approach to moss poles, you'd know that they are a vertical extension of the pot and offering incredible propagation benefits. Specifically with variegated plants, sometimes it can be a bit tricky to propagate them and the success rate can be quite low. So growing them up a moss pole, and let's have a look at the incredible root system that this plant has grown. Growing these plants up a moss pole just means that there are so many roots going into the moss pole, creating their own little root system within the moss pole, so that I don't really have to worry about root rot, because even if there was root rot down in the pot, I've got a whole additional root system within the pole. And if I ever want to take cuttings, and I mean variegated plants are usually good plants to take cuttings off if you want to recoup some of the initial investment, then every cutting is already propagated, which means that it's going to grow a new shoot really quickly. With variegated monsteras, people very often experience issues in propagating them or even getting them to grow a new leaf after it has grown some roots. With the moss pole technique, the plant has already a decent root system by the time you take the cutting, so they're going to reshoot much quicker and re-establish much quicker. Now with these roots, they're also super unruly, and it's very bright. I hope you are still able to see it. I hope I can fix it in post. But this is just what it actually looks like, right? But the roots are super unruly. Have a look at them. They go in and out of the moss pole like crazy. But for every root that goes out of the moss pole, there's also like 5 roots that go in the moss pole. So it's okay, you don't need to worry if like 1 or 2 roots kind of got lost and didn't make it into the moss pole or find their way out of the moss pole again. Roots love aeration. These roots definitely have aeration. And as long as your plant is happy and growing and sizing up, then don't fix what's not broken. Alrighty, next up, a smaller one. So far all of my plants were really large. The variegated monstera has also been on this pole for about 2.5 years. But this is my newest obsession. A little spotlight on it. Perfect. This is Philodendron El Choco Red. And I've only had this for about 10 months now. And it is growing on a pole without a pot. And it's still thriving. That's just a little experiment. I will definitely give it a pot eventually when it moves out of the cabinet, just something to sit on as well. All I'm trying to say with this is like you don't need a huge pot. Like all of these plants so far you've seen, they were all potted up in 20 centimeter pots, so quite small if you compared it to the size of the leaves. But it's okay because the moss pole is a vertical extension of the pot. Now this is also a slightly different moss pole. This is plastic backed. It's from Grow Vertical, which is also always linked in the description. And the plastic backing just ensures that the pole dries out slower. Because I don't have a pot over here, this plant is relying on the roots within the pole, so I really don't want that pole to dry out because that could be the plant's demise. Now, this is called El Choco Red because of its beautiful reds. Oh, that's beautiful. And I reckon next month or so the plant would have outgrown the IKEA cabinet. I'll give it a pot and then it's going to move into the room with all the other velvet philodendrons. Alrighty, next up we've got my monstera silta El Salvador. Can we see this, I think? Sorry, the viewfinder is way too far away, but I think this should be in frame. Now, same happened over here as with the gigas. I have 2 plants in here. 2 poles in here, bottom pole and top pole, extended one of them, and I'll insert this little clip so you can see it more closely. The shoots from the bottom pole are finding their way onto the top pole, so I'll eventually have 4, 5, 6, I don't know how many shoots there are on here anymore, growing on one pole. Now this plant has been in my collection for a really, really long time. It was one of my first plants and I think it was the 3rd plant I ever put on a moss pole. And I've propagated this plant so much over the years. So I think at some stage there was up to 11 cuttings growing on this pole, but with every chop and extend, a couple don't really make it. But the shoot that has matured the most is giving me these amazing fenestrations while keeping its silver markings. And this is a plant that is kind of like 360 on this pole, right? Like this plant has truly taken over the moss pole on all sides, and also has created a crazy, crazy root system. One of my all-time favorites, this plant is also in a 25 centimeter pot, so slightly larger than any of the other ones, and that's just because there are so many cuttings in there, and obviously more cuttings means more roots. You do ultimately need to provide your plants with enough room for roots, otherwise the plant's growth will eventually be stunted, but that room for roots doesn't necessarily need to be within the pot. It can be vertical, right? So hence the moss pole being a vertical extension of the pot. Alrighty, let's pop this back on here. We don't have to move far. It's already in frame. Here we go. My philodendron, my epipremnum mandula. This is probably a plant that gets the most attention online. It's often in my videos because it's right here, and I often get asked, what is this amazing variegated plant? It's just a mandula pothos that I grew up a moss pole. Now it's been taken about 2 years to get to this stage, and it has not had any chop and extend yet. So you can still see some of the juvenile leaves at the bottom over here, but you can also see that the stem is eventually getting a little bare because these leaves down here would have been over 2 years old. They just, you know, gave up eventually, but it's almost time for a chop and extend. Now this plant really peaked here. That was around March of this year at my old apartment, and then going into winter and moving into the new apartment where I think it gets slightly less light, it kind of reverted a little bit, but now it seems to be increasing in leaf size again. So let's see what summer has in store for this plant. If you want to variegate a plant and grow it up a moss pole, this is probably my favorite because it is ultimately just a pothos, so it's quite easy. It does grows slowly, but it sizes up nicely, and each leaf is super rewarding, and the variegation, the shades of green and white and mint and all of that, I think it's really, really stunning, and it's just a really affordable plant as well, or at least over here in Australia. All right, let me park this on the side because the next plant that we're talking about is right next to it, and I need to get it out of its corner. Oh, this is a need for water. This is my monstera adensonia subspecies laniata, and this is I have 3 of them, but this is the most mature one. This is actually the first plant I ever put on a moss pile. So it has been with me for 3.5 to 4 years now. And there are 3 shoots on this pole, but one is here and one is here. So 2 of them are kind of at the very, like just at the halfway mark, whereas the top cutting is already here. Now this top cutting was actually even more advanced. It was already kind of here, like half a year ago. So I was like, hang on, it's growing way too fast. It's gonna outgrow the other 2 cuttings, and I want a lush pole. I don't just want to have 1 cutting on here, I want multiple cuttings. So what I did is I chopped the top off, and since then it has reshot in 2 spots. So I now have 2 vines growing on here, just coming from that top vine. So I doubled the impact of just that 1 vine by just giving it a top cutting. Now you can propagate that top cutting as well, but often it actually rots because it had no roots by the time I cut it. Now this plant is also currently giving me its first inflorescences ever. I'm really happy, so it's clearly really excited. Now after the chop, I do have to say though, the leaves obviously revert a little bit, so it gave me these small leaves over here. But that's normal, right? It then, after this leaf, it recovered straight away with this leaf over here, then this. So it starts sizing up again really quickly after the initial shock of the chop. Now, this plant is on a grow vertical moss pole, but a thicker grow vertical moss pole. And that's really because about a year ago, I realized that this plant has probably reached its potential. The moss pole was full, like full. Like I couldn't squeeze the moss pole anymore because it was just full of roots. So remember when I said you do need to provide your plants with enough room for roots? Well, the moss pole in itself didn't provide sufficient room for the roots anymore. So I decided to give a larger pole, this grow vertical, I think they call it long fatty. And it just has so much more volume in here, and you can really see all of these roots pushing towards the edge of that plastic and then being funneled into the pot. So this plant was able to grow a massive root system within its moss pole. All right, let me put this back, and I'll just pop a bottle of water on here. And yes, I put fertilizer, so my GT Foliage Focus, also linked in the description. I put that into the bottle that I water the pole with, because the roots are in the pole, so I want to provide the roots with nutrients, right? And then the water is just going to drip into the pot. I very rarely actively water the pot. I really just actively water the moss pole, and I let gravity do the rest for me. One last one to go, and I thought I'll switch it up a little bit. This is my Philodendron Ring of Fire. It's so hard for you to see it, I think. There you go, I don't know, this is kind of from the back. It lives right here under my Soltec grow light. So the light source is coming from above, which means these leaves are facing up rather than kind of forward. So I think this way you can probably see it best. But because it has nice variegation, it kind of looks nice from either side, if that makes sense. Now this is a plant that isn't really like, I mean it is a climber, but when people think about it, they don't often think of it as a climber because it grows really slowly. So this has been on its moss pole for a while now, like probably over a year, and it's only climbed up to here at the moment. It is also growing in inflow. Yeah, there we go, you can see this, and this is the inflow. But nevertheless, it is growing and it's putting roots into the pole. So the pole over here is not so much a vertical support. In this instance, the pole is really an extension of the root system. And there are roots sneaking out the top over here. There, like one little root. You can't see it because it's not see-through. Sometimes in the right light, you can somehow see some root outlines. But yeah, it is definitely like taking full advantage of the moss pole. And again, another plant that you don't have to worry about chopping and extending and so on. I do think that the vertical growing also just gives it a nice display. So I'm really loving this plant. It's probably best to look at it this way. I don't know which way. I'll find out when I edit the video which one worked best. So, that's it. Let's keep this video short and sharp. Those were 10 of my favorite plants on moss poles at the moment. There are a lot of plants I haven't showed you. I have probably 30 or 40 odd plants on moss poles, but not all of them are thriving at all times. I just really showed you the ones that I'm currently really happy with based on their current growth. But, you know, we're dealing with living organisms over here. They, you know, leaves come and go. Sometimes the plant looks a little bit nicer than other times. Sometimes we're struggling with pests, and then the plant just needs a little bit of time to recover and grow new leaves and so on. But it's also totally normal that not all plants look extremely Instagrammable at all times. That's not the goal, right? The goal is the journey, or like, to me, the journey is the goal. I love the act of growing and seeing these plants transform over time and create like these living artworks that I can decorate my apartment with. Alrighty, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found some inspiration and you might add some of these plants to your wish list as well. Again, please check out my moss pole tutorial as well as my moss pole playlist, which I'll link at the end screen. Happy growing, like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I will see you next time. Bye. Bye.